Thank you so much for having me today in your important event. Thank you so much to Local Network Korea for your invitation. My name is Anna Krüpp. I am Senior Manager for Environment and Climate at the UN Global Compact, working there on climate mitigation, adaptation, and just transition, which will be the topic of today's conversation. And I'm based out of New York City, so very happy that this could be arranged through a recorded format so that I can still share our insights with you. So let me dive right into the content, moving on to the next slide. I think it is very clear, of course, that the planet is in trouble. Latest reports assess that government commitments are not on track to reach the 1.5-degree goals. And I just spent the last 2 weeks at the COP27 conference in Egypt, which had a few encouraging results, but overall it is very clear that the transition is not moving as fast as we need it. We need a really big and systemic transition, which will require major changes across all industries. And those major changes will, of course, imply changes to the workforce, to people's lives, and the way how we use resources. Of course, transitions have happened in the past. It's not the first time that we face a challenge like that. But we know, apologies, we know that those transitions have not always been just. And for this reason, the concept of just transition has been put forward as a conceptual framework. So we ensure the transition to a resilient net zero world leaves no one behind. And like the Secretary General here points out, a just transition means leaving no person or country behind. So moving forward, the vision and the key opportunities and challenges and guiding principles of just transition are established in the framework of the International Labour Organization, ILO, guidelines for a just transition, and we very much encourage you to look those up. And the UN Secretary General has called on countries to adopt those ILO guidelines as a minimum standard to simultaneously address environmental, economic, and the social dimensions of sustainable development. So moving to the next slide, what does this mean in practice? What do we mean when we talk about just transition? As I mentioned in the beginning, confronting the climate crisis requires decisive and coherent action with significant impact on workers, communities, industries, and regions. And the just transition works to ensure that the transition is orderly, inclusive, and just, and creates decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. This means specifically to keep a social dialogue and consult workers on the questions that are most relevant for them. Consult communities on the impacts as they are active stakeholders that are part of the solution. They are not a problem to mitigate it. They will have very insightful perspectives and can be part of developing the solutions we need. It is not only about phasing out older industries such as coal, but also very much about building new industry, using new technologies, and upskilling the workforce to enable them to use those technologies. And then, of course, just transition is not an independent practice, but it is a principles-based approach for climate change mitigation and adaptation alike, relevant for all countries and sectors. UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed summarizes this in the quote here on the slide. Meeting the climate challenge means major shifts in our economies and societies, and these will naturally bring significant impacts on people, families, and communities that touch the core of their identities and well-being. A just transition cannot be an afterthought. It is an integral part of climate action and a responsibility for all of us. So this just as a kind of as a background of where we start off, but what does it mean for the work of the UN Global Compact and for the private sector? Moving on to the next slide, I just want to briefly explain a few ways of working that we have in the UN Global Compact, as we are engaging companies, as you well know, in different ways, both at the local as well as the global level. And so one example of our work at the global level are the so-called Think Labs, which are a tool to shape the definition of leadership in a specific issue area and work with advanced companies across the globe on thought leadership and continuous performance improvement. They are by definition time-bound, so they have a clear start and end date, and they address quite a specific challenge. So in the case of our climate work, we have decided last year to launch a Think Lab on Just Transition to work with companies and partners across the globe on how the private sector can contribute to a just transition, as we heard in the beginning, is really instrumental for our transition to net zero. Apart from the Think Lab on Just Transition, we also have current Think Labs up and running and upcoming on living wage, transformational government, women entrepreneurship, and climate smart ocean and blue finance. And so these are these are partly already active and partly will be in the next few months. So feel free to keep an eye out of those if those topics are for specific interest for you. But going back to Just Transition, after this little detour on the Think Lab format, on the next slide, I want to discuss a little bit the role of business. Of course, when we think about the transition of sectors and the transition of entire industries, we think a lot about government action, and the role of government is very important. But the private sector also has a key role to play in shaping more responsible business practices that protect the communities and the lands they're working in, as well as protecting the global workforce. Businesses must give back to the communities they're working in or manufacturing in by contributing to community projects and ensure that they're respecting the natural environment and not over-exploiting land and resources. When it comes to the workforce, just to give a few more specific examples, business can offer social protection to those who may offer job losses due to the reduction of extractive industries such as coal, and help and upskill workers so they are well equipped to work in a greener economy. And last but not least, the private sector, of course, holds power in influencing government action. So ambitious corporate action can send market signals for countries to enhance climate policies, social protection programs, and increased investments into businesses and communities that support the transition. And in the conversations that we had with the companies that are engaged in the Think Lab, one thing became really clear. Working on just transition makes a lot of business sense. It is not that NGOs or the UN or governments need really to push companies there, because companies that are succeeding today are those that have a climate plan and that have a dialogue with their workers. What is that business case? Why does it make sense for business? Just transition can help companies to reduce risks and cost. It enhances productivity, improves stakeholder alignment with customers, policymakers, and investors, and also mitigates systemic risks, leading overall to greater business resilience. And of course, there are also quite a few challenges. I spoke for a few minutes already, but it might still be a little bit vague on what it really is that we talk about when we talk about just transition. And so the aim of the Think Lab and the work that we do with companies is to demystify what just transition means for business and to identify priority actions, how companies can get started. And these are laid out on the next slide, and I want to take a bit of time to walk you through those 7 priority actions for business. So moving on to that slide, these are the actions that we identified in our introductory brief that was published in August this year, and that you can download as well on our website. So the brief summarizes just transition, clarifies all the definitions needed, the background and the historical implications, and then identifies or suggests rather 7 key actions for the private sector to follow. First of all, of course, make a map. Provide clarity, where do you stand? This means for an internal engagement on just transition, map key touch points and identify priorities in light of your company's specific impact and influence. Second, set a foundation, the respect for rights at work and other human rights through robust policies and practices, gender and social equity in the workforce. So really focus on those foundational rights in the first place. Third, engage. I mentioned how important it is to engage with those that are impacted by the transition, workforce and communities. So engage with work organizations in social dialogue with all affected stakeholders as a core piece of transition planning implementation, and monitoring. 4, plan. Long-term business planning for a just transition integrates social dialogue and stakeholder engagement. It prioritizes job creation and reskilling, and it protects groups in vulnerable situations. And through this, maximizes local benefits, promotes social equity, and supports equitable customer access. 5, take action. So after preparing, making a map, setting the foundations, engaging and planning, of course, the next step is to implement those plans. And so just transition plans put into action across relevant business functions, integrating ongoing social dialogue, engaging stakeholders, carrying out due diligence on human rights and environmental impacts of the company's operations. The next one is highly, highly important, and I really want to stress it a lot: partner. Just transition can only work if we collaborate across government, across the workforce and the private sector. So a social dialogue with workers' organizations and governments for a more coordinated action around key challenges is crucial. This also includes partnerships with employer organizations, with regional or sectoral initiatives, and across supply chains to really enable the environment for a just transition. Implementation really can only function when those different stakeholders work together. And last but not least, measure, report with the goal to learn and communicate. So measurement and reporting of actions and challenges and impacts related to just transition can lead to more learning, cooperation, and accountability. And so those benefits that can be identified reduce risk and cost, enhance productivity, and in a way ultimately show that just transition is an opportunity for your business and a priority for our society and necessity for our planet. And finally, moving on to the last slide, I want to point you to a few key resources, as this was, of course, a very short overview on the core elements of just transition as they are outlined in our introductory brief. And so I want to encourage all of you to have a look at these resources to further deep dive into the topic. And so first of all, the introductory brief that I cited the key actions from is here on the left, Introduction to Just Transition, a business brief. The Network Korea has translated this brief into Korean language, so feel free to pick up a copy when you leave today's event. And then we also have the first of 4 thematic briefs very recently published. Just a few days ago, we published our brief, Just Transition for Climate Adaptation, which is the first of a series of 4 that will deep dive after the introduction into a bit more specifics for certain topics like adaptation here in the first place, and then upcoming finance, which will be published in December this year, and early next year, 2 additional briefs on supply chains and renewable energies. So we have the introductory brief as the baseline, and that's also the longest brief. I believe it's about 30 pages or so. And then the thematic briefs that are shorter, very concise, and kind of go deeper in specific action items. So very much encourage you to have a look at the existing one and then keep an eye out on the upcoming ones in the next few days and months. And last but not least, we also developed a Academy series. The Academy is the UN Global Compact's online learning platform. And just about a month ago in October, we published the first session on just transition within the Academy, which is a conversation between Sharan Burrow and our CEO, Sanda Ojiambo, on how to enable a just transition. And this session is available on demand to all of you. So very much encourage you to check it out to learn more about our efforts. So with this, I'm coming to a close, and I thank you very, very much for your attention, and our colleagues in Korea for the invitation. And I wish you a very successful event ahead with impactful conversations. Thank you very much.